3 days before I found the pipe, I was standing in ankle-deep water, wondering if I was losing my mind. That probably sounds dramatic, but if you've ever lived on the same piece of land for nearly 20 years, you know every inch of it the way you know your own hands. You know where water settles after a storm, where the grass grows thickest in July, where the deer cut across the fence line when winter starts creeping in. You know what belongs there, and what I was looking at that morning absolutely did not belong there. The water had spread across almost half my lower pasture, turning what should have been green grazing land into something that looked more like a neglected pond. Trash floated near the fence posts, plastic bottles, food wrappers, even chunks of construction foam. My horses wouldn't go near it. That was the part that got me. Animals notice things before people do. I stood there holding a coffee mug that had gone cold 15 minutes earlier and watched my old mare Daisy refuse to step into a section of grass she'd grazed her entire life. Something was wrong. At first I blamed the rain. We'd gotten hammered for nearly a week straight, one storm after another rolling through western Tennessee like they had nowhere else to be. The kind of rain that settles into the soil and just sits there. But the more I looked, the less it made sense. See, my property sits outside a little town called Hollow Creek. Not much there besides farms, feed stores, a diner that somehow survives on coffee and gossip, and enough church signs to remind you every Sunday is coming whether you're ready or not. I'd bought the land when I was 38. Back then it was mostly overgrown pasture and a half-collapsed barn that looked one strong wind away from becoming a memory. Now I was 57. The barn stood straight, the fences were solid, the mortgage was gone, and for the first time in a long while life felt pretty simple. Maybe that's why what happened next bothered me so much. Simple things are worth protecting. I set the coffee down and started walking. When you're a landowner long enough, you become a part-time detective whether you want to or not. Broken fence? Figure it out. Missing livestock? Figure it out. Strange tracks? Figure it out. So I followed the water. It didn't take long. The northern edge of my property bordered a brand new development called Maple Grove Heights. Funny name, there wasn't a single maple tree left up there. The developers had bulldozed most of them 6 months earlier. Now it was rows of fresh houses with bright roofs, trimmed lawns, and signs promising luxury country living. Country living. That phrase always makes me laugh. People buy 5,000 square foot houses on quarter-acre lots and call it country living. Anyway, as I approached the fence line, I saw something that stopped me dead. A concrete retaining wall, brand new, and sticking straight through the middle of it was a drainage pipe big enough to crawl through. Water was pouring out, not trickling, pouring, a steady stream, like somebody had turned on a faucet and forgotten about it. I remember standing there staring at that thing for several seconds because my brain honestly refused to process what I was seeing. The pipe wasn't there last month. Hell, I was pretty sure it wasn't there the previous week. The soil around it was still raw red clay. Bulldozer tracks were visible everywhere, and every gallon coming through that pipe was heading directly onto my land. That's when the puzzle pieces started clicking together. The flooding, the trash, the chemical smell, the debris. It wasn't rainwater, it was runoff. Somebody had decided my pasture was going to solve their problem. Now, maybe you're a better person than I am. Maybe you'd immediately assume there had been some misunderstanding. Maybe you'd think there was a permit somewhere. A conversation that never happened. A paperwork mistake. I wanted to believe that too. For about 5 minutes. Then I called the number on the development sign. The guy who answered introduced himself as Ethan Mercer, property manager, professional voice, calm, confident. The kind of voice that sounds expensive. I explained what I was seeing. I kept my tone respectful. I gave him every opportunity to tell me there'd been some mistake. Instead, he said something I'll never forget. He said, "Well, the water has to go somewhere." Just like that. No apology, no concern, nothing. I remember looking at the pipe while he said it, listening to thousands of gallons rushing onto my property. And for a second I thought maybe I'd heard him wrong. So I asked, "Excuse me," he sighed. Actually sighed. Then said, "Your property sits lower than ours. That's the natural drainage path." Natural drainage path? That's what he called it, like they'd discovered gravity and deserved a medal. I felt my jaw tighten. Natural? I asked. That concrete pipe wasn't naturally growing out of the ground last month. There was a pause, not a long one, just enough. Then he laughed, not loudly, not cruelly, Just the kind of laugh somebody gives when they think they're talking to a person who can't stop them. You can file a complaint if you'd like. That was it. That was his answer. File a complaint. I don't know why that irritated me more than anything else. Maybe because he sounded so certain, like he'd had this conversation before, like he already knew how it ended. After we hung up, I stood there beside that fence for a long time. The water kept flowing. The pasture kept flooding. And something inside me started changing. Not anger, not exactly. Anger burns hot and fast. This was colder, more focused. The kind of feeling you get when somebody mistakes your patience for weakness. That evening, I sat on my porch watching another storm build over the hills. The clouds were turning dark purple. Thunder rolled somewhere in the distance. Daisy and the other horses had already moved closer to the barn. And I kept thinking about Ethan's voice, the certainty in it, the arrogance, the assumption that I'd simply accept whatever happened because fighting back would take too much time. Maybe he was right. Maybe most people would have waited. Maybe most people would have trusted the system. But as I watched those storm clouds moving closer, I couldn't shake one thought. If that pipe kept running through another week of rain, my lower pasture was finished, and if nobody was coming to stop it, I might have to. The next morning, I drove straight into Maple Grove Heights to have a face-to-face conversation with the man who seemed so confident over the phone. And looking back now, that meeting changed everything. The next morning, I drove straight into Maple Grove Heights to have a face-to-face conversation with the man who seemed so confident over the phone. And looking back now, that meeting changed everything. The development sat on top of a ridge overlooking most of the valley. From a distance, it looked impressive, I'll give them that. Fresh pavement, decorative street lamps, brand new landscaping, little flags waving in front of model homes. The kind of place designed to make people feel successful the moment they turned into the entrance. But the closer I got, the harder it became to ignore what I'd seen from below. That retention pond. It sat behind the first row of houses like a giant bowl filled almost to the rim. The water level was high, too high, and suddenly I understood why that pipe existed. They weren't managing their runoff. They were exporting it. I parked near the sales office and walked inside. A young receptionist greeted me with a practiced smile. The smile disappeared when she noticed the dried mud still caked on my boots. Funny how quickly people can tell when you're not there to buy something. I'm looking for Ethan Mercer. She hesitated, just for a second, then pointed toward a back office. Last door on the right. I thanked her and headed back. When I opened the door, Ethan looked exactly how I'd imagined. Mid-40s, pressed blue shirt, expensive watch, perfect haircut, the kind of guy who probably owned more golf clubs than work clubs. He stood up with a smile that somehow felt rehearsed. "Mr. Walker," he said, "so we finally meet." I didn't sit, didn't shake his hand either. I just looked him straight in the eye. "Your pipe is flooding my pasture." His smile faded a little. Not much. Just enough. Then he leaned back into his chair. "Actually," he said, "our drainage system is operating according to approved engineering plans." There it was. Corporate language. The language people use when they want responsibility to disappear into paperwork. I folded my arms. "My barn doesn't care about engineering plans." He chuckled. It annoyed me more than if he'd started yelling. "Look," he said, "the county approved everything. The county approved dumping water on my property?" He shrugged. "The topography dictates water flow." I stared at him. Then I leaned forward slightly. Gravity didn't install that pipe. For the first time, his expression hardened, not dramatically. Just enough for me to realize the polite version of Ethan Mercer had limits. "We followed regulations. And did you ask permission?" Silence. A brief one. But silence all the same. Then he looked down at a document on his desk. "If you have concerns, there's a formal complaint process." There it was again. The process. Always the process. The magical word people use when they believe time works in their favor. I nodded once. Got it. Then I turned and walked out. Because I knew if I stayed another minute, the conversation wasn't going to improve. The county office was about 20 minutes away. Small building. Fluorescent lighting. The smell of old paperwork and stale coffee. You know the type. I explained everything. Showed photos, showed videos, showed the flooding. The pipe. The debris. The woman behind the counter listened carefully and typed notes into her computer. When I finished, she handed me a case number. "We'll assign an inspector." "How long?" She checked something on her screen, then gave me the answer I was afraid of. 4 to 6 weeks. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, because sometimes the only alternative is screaming. 4 to 6 weeks? She gave me an apologetic smile. We're understaffed. Of course they were. Everybody was understaffed. Meanwhile, my pasture was turning into a swamp. I drove home feeling worse than when I'd left, not because the county didn't care. The woman genuinely seemed concerned. The problem was simpler than that. The clock was moving faster than the system. By the time somebody investigated, the damage would already be done. That night, another storm rolled through. Harder than the last one. I barely slept. Every time thunder rattled the windows, I found myself imagining that pipe still pouring water downhill. At sunrise, I grabbed my rain jacket and headed outside. The pasture looked worse, much worse. The flooded section had expanded another 30 feet. Water sat dangerously close to the barn, and that's when I saw something that finally pushed me over the edge. One of my horses had developed a skin irritation along her lower legs. Nothing life-threatening, but enough to remind me that this wasn't some abstract legal dispute. This was affecting living animals, my property, my livelihood, my responsibility, and if I didn't protect it, nobody else would. Around noon, I called my neighbor, Frank Holloway. Now, Frank was one of those old-school guys who could operate heavy equipment better than most people drive cars. Owned a small excavation company, never talked much, never wasted words. When he answered, I explained the situation. There was a long pause. Then he asked one question. You got property surveys? Yep. You know exactly where your line is? Every inch. Another pause. Then he laughed. A low, dangerous kind of laugh. Well, he said, that's interesting. The next morning, Frank showed up with a backhoe and 3 truckloads of clay. We spent half the day reviewing property markers, double-checking everything, then checking again, because if we were going to do anything, it needed to be legal, perfectly legal. No shortcuts, no mistakes, no excuses. Once we were satisfied, we started building. The berm stretched along the northern edge of my property, slowly rising from the ground like a defensive wall. Nothing enormous, maybe 2 feet high, but dense, packed tight, heavy clay, the kind water hates. Frank worked methodically. Scoop, dump, pack, repeat, hour after hour. By late afternoon, the shape was obvious. For the first time since this whole mess started, I felt something close to hope. The water coming through the pipe would no longer spread freely across my pasture. It would hit resistance. It would stay contained. But as helpful as the berm was, the real problem still sat 30 yards away. That pipe, that damned pipe. Water continued rushing through it non-stop, as if nothing had changed, as if my property still belonged to them. Frank shut down the machine and climbed out of the cab. We stood there staring at it together. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, he said, You know they're not gonna like this. I nodded. Probably not. They'll call lawyers, probably. He smirked, then looked directly at the pipe. The lawyers don't change property lines. That made me smile. For the first time in days. After Frank left, I drove into town and bought several rolls of industrial pond liner, concrete blocks, heavy-duty straps, a few other materials. The cashier asked what project I was working on. I told him flood control, which wasn't exactly a lie. By sunset, I had everything stacked beside the fence, ready, waiting. The storm clouds gathering on the horizon looked darker than anything we'd seen all week. Meteorologists were predicting another major system overnight, the biggest yet. I stood there staring at that pipe while the wind pushed through the trees, listening to water rush through concrete, listening to a problem somebody else had decided should belong to me. And for the first time, I made a decision, a very simple one. If they were determined to keep their water on my property, then maybe it was time to stop accepting deliveries. The next morning, Frank came back. One look at the materials sitting beside the fence, and he immediately understood what I was thinking. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He just looked toward the pipe, then back at me. You sure? I stared at the rushing water, at the flooded pasture, at my barn, at my horses. And finally, I nodded. Yeah. For the first time since this started, I was absolutely sure, and neither of us had any idea that within 72 hours, half of Maple Grove Heights would be in full-blown panic. For the first time since this started, I was absolutely sure, and neither of us had any idea that within 72 hours, half of Maple Grove Heights would be in full-blown panic. Frank and I waited until the flow slowed just enough for us to work safely, Not because we were trying to hide anything. Quite the opposite. I wanted everything visible, everything documented, everything done on my side of the property line. We stretched the industrial liner across the mouth of the pipe and secured it tight. Then we stacked concrete blocks in front of it, building a reinforced barrier designed to resist pressure without damaging the structure itself. That part mattered. I wasn't destroying their pipe. I wasn't trespassing. I wasn't touching anything on their property. I was simply refusing access to mine. There's a difference. A very important difference. By sunset, the water had stopped. For the first time in weeks, the pipe sat silent. Frank wiped mud from his hands and looked at our handiwork. "Well," he said, "they're definitely going to notice." I laughed. "Yeah." Then I looked toward the ridge. "They will." The first phone call came the next morning. I didn't answer. The second came 20 minutes later. I ignored that one too. By lunchtime, there were 6 missed calls from Ethan Mercer. That was interesting. Apparently, the process moved a lot faster when the problem belonged to him. Around 3 o'clock, a black SUV came flying down the gravel road toward my property. Ethan climbed out before the vehicle had fully stopped. 2 other people followed him, one woman carrying a folder, one man carrying what looked like a tablet. They marched straight toward the fence line. The moment Ethan saw the blocked pipe, his face changed. All that calm confidence I'd seen in his office was gone, replaced by something much closer to panic. "What the hell is this?" he shouted. I stayed where I was, leaning against the fence, perfectly calm. My property. His jaw tightened. "You blocked our drainage outlet." "No," I said. "I blocked access to my land." The woman with the folder immediately started flipping through paperwork. The man with the tablet began taking photographs. Ethan stepped closer. "You can't do this." I shrugged. "Looks like I just did." For a moment I honestly thought he might climb over the fence. Instead, he pointed toward the ridge. "Do you have any idea what happens if water backs up?" I looked past him toward the retention pond, then back at him. "Funny," I said. "That's exactly what I asked when it was flooding my pasture." That landed. You could see it, not because he suddenly agreed with me, because he hated hearing his own logic pointed back at him. The argument continued for another 10 minutes, most of the same talking points. Engineering, approvals, compliance, regulations. Eventually Ethan made a threat, not a dramatic one, not movie villain stuff, the kind real people make, the kind wrapped in legal language. "You'll be hearing from our attorneys." I smiled. "Tell them to bring boots." That ended the conversation. They left shortly afterward, and for a few hours everything was quiet. Then the storm arrived. The biggest storm of the season. Rain hammered the valley all night, the kind that rattles windows and keeps dogs awake. I sat on my porch listening to it, not celebrating, not worried, just waiting, because one thing had become very clear. By morning, somebody was going to have a serious problem. The only question was who. When I woke up, my phone was already buzzing. Text messages, missed calls, voicemails, most from numbers I didn't recognize. One from Frank. The message contained exactly 4 words. "You need to see this." So I drove up to Maple Grove Heights. And honestly, the sight almost made me feel bad. Almost. The retention pond had overflowed. Water had spread through sections of the development. Nothing catastrophic. Nobody was floating down the street in a canoe. But it was bad enough. Several basements had taken water. Lawns were destroyed, mud covered portions of the road. Portable pumps had already been brought in. Contractors were running around like firefighters at a brush fire. Meanwhile, down in my pasture, everything was fine. The berm held. The barn stayed dry. The horses were grazing. And that's when I realized something. The water had never belonged on my property. The moment it lost access to my land, it immediately exposed flaws in theirs. Around noon, another vehicle arrived. County inspector, old pickup truck, dusty, practical. The kind of truck owned by someone who spends more time outdoors than behind a desk. His name was Robert Gaines. Turns out my complaint hadn't been forgotten after all. The flooding inside Maple Grove Heights had accelerated everyone's schedule. Funny how that works. Robert spent nearly 2 hours examining everything. The pasture, the pipe, the berm, the retention pond, the development, the photographs I'd taken weeks earlier. He asked dozens of questions, most of which Ethan seemed increasingly uncomfortable answering. Then came the moment that changed everything. We were standing near the retaining wall when Robert crouched beside the pipe and examined the concrete structure. After a minute, he stood up and looked directly at Ethan. "Can I see the permit for this discharge outlet?" Silence. Not the awkward kind, the dangerous kind. The woman with the folder immediately began searching through documents. Page after page. Nothing. Ethan cleared his throat. It's part of the overall drainage system. Robert nodded, slowly, then asked again. Permit? More silence. The answer was becoming obvious, and everyone standing there knew it. Finally, Robert crossed his arms. Do you have an easement agreement with Mr. Walker? No. Written permission? No. Recorded drainage rights? No. Robert looked around at the group, then let out a long breath, the kind people take when they've already reached a conclusion. Okay, nobody spoke. Even the construction crews nearby seemed quieter. Then Robert delivered the sentence Ethan clearly wasn't expecting. This outlet is directing runoff onto adjacent private property without authorization. That is a violation. You could practically hear the air leave Ethan's lungs. He immediately started arguing, talking about approvals, engineering reports, investment costs, homeowners, schedules, deadlines. Robert listened for maybe 15 seconds, then held up a hand, and I'll never forget what he said next. Being expensive doesn't make it legal. Just like that. Game over. Within days, the county issued formal orders. The outlet had to be taken out of service. The development needed a compliant drainage solution entirely within its own boundaries. No exceptions. No delays. No shortcuts. The next few weeks were fascinating. Crews arrived daily. Excavators, engineers, surveyors, pump trucks, new underground infrastructure, new containment systems, new drainage routes. Basically, everything they should have built from the beginning. Rumors started circulating around town. The cost estimates kept climbing. 80,000, 100,000, 150,000. Nobody seemed to know the final number, only that it hurt. A lot. As for Ethan, I never really spoke to him again. No apology, no handshake, no acknowledgement. Just distance. And honestly, that was fine. I wasn't looking for revenge. At least not by then. I was looking for peace. And eventually I got it. The pasture recovered. Fresh grass returned. The barn remained dry. The horses forgot the entire ordeal long before I did. Animals are smarter that way. They move on. People tend to replay things. Even now, years later, whenever I drive past what used to be Maple Grove Heights, I still think about that pipe. Not because of the money. Not because of the legal fight. Not because I won. I think about how easily all of it could have been avoided. One conversation, one agreement, one honest acknowledgement that somebody else's property mattered. Instead, a handful of people convinced themselves the easier solution was pushing their problem downhill and hoping nobody pushed back. Maybe that's what bothers me most. Not the flooding, the assumption. The belief that convenience somehow outweighs responsibility. So here's the question I've argued about with friends ever since. If you had been standing where I was watching your land flood while everyone told you to wait for the process, would you have blocked that pipe? Or would you have left it alone and trusted the system to eventually catch up? I genuinely want to know. Drop your answer in the comments. And while you're at it, tell me who you think was really in the wrong here. Was it the developer? Was it me? Or was everybody guilty of letting things go too far? If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves real-life neighbor disputes and property battles. Because trust me, out here in the country, fences don't always create boundaries. Sometimes they reveal them.